The federal government has many ways that it tries to control the economy, especially inflation, and something that is connected to those inflation dominoes that we talked about a couple videos ago is interest rates. Connected to interest rates are discount rates, which are practically just interest rates for the bank. The federal government controls supply and demand with the discount rate, and that is where we get the minimum reserve requirement. So, the minimum reserve requirement is the amount of money required by the federal government to keep in the bank from each deposit. So, let's look at an example. For a $1,000 deposit, if the minimum reserve requirement was 1%, how much money would need to be held in the bank to fulfill a 1% minimum reserve requirement? $10. For a 5% minimum reserve requirement, we would need a reserve of $50. 10% of the $1,000 would be $100 required reserve. For a 12% reserve requirement, there would be $125 required to be reserved. For a $15 reserve requirement, you would need $150, and for a 25% reserve requirement, you would be required to have $250 of your $1,000 still held in the bank. So if we have this amount that is required to be held in the bank, there is another proportion of it that is allowed to be lended to other members of the bank. So let's say with this $1,000 deposit, if you are required to have 1% of that reserved, how much money are you required to keep in the bank? $10. So then out of that $1,000, how much can you loan to people? $990. So for a 5% reserve requirement, you're required to keep $50. So how much can you lend people? $950. For a 10% reserve requirement, we're required to hold $10, and therefore you can loan out $100. Whoops! Therefore, you are allowed to loan out $900. For a 12.5 reserve requirement, you need to hold $125, and so therefore you can loan out $875. For a 15% reserve requirement, alright, I'm gonna stop writing dollar signs because they don't fit. So, for a 15% reserve requirement, you're required to hold $150 in the bank, and so therefore, the bank can still loan out $850 of those $1,000 to other bank members. And finally, for 25% reserve requirement, the bank has to keep $250 in the bank, and so therefore, they can loan out $750 to the rest of their members. So one thing that this really applies to is that so these numbers that we found here, these are called excess reserves. It's the amount of money that the bank can lend out after they have reserved the required amount. So with those excess reserves, the federal government, well, not the federal government, but the amount of money is able to be lended out, and this actually causes inflation and increases the amount of money in the system. This increase of money in the system is called a money multiplier. It's the percent of money in the economy that is increased by the minimum reserve requirements, or the MRRs, and so a money multiplier is 1 over the reserve requirement. So let's do an example with that. So so let's say that we have the following reserve requirements. Let's calculate the money multiplier using our 1 over minimum reserve requirement percent. Alright, so if we have a 1% minimum reserve requirement, then our money multiplier would be 100. If we have a 5% minimum reserve requirement, it would be 20. 10% would be 10. 12.5 would be 8. 15 would be 6.67, and 25 would be 4. So because we have this money multiplier, we can then use it to find the total increase of money within the system. So the total increase is equal to the money multiplier times the deposit amount. So if we have this deposit amount, we can, and our money multiplier, we can find the total increase, and and we can also find the expansion of the supply. So with this, let's say we have $1,000 in excess reserves. What is the total amount of money that can be created by that? So 1% with a money multiplier of 100. 100 times a deposit of 1,000 is 100,000. And I'm leaving dollar signs off just for space. Alright, 5%, we would end up with a $20,000 total increase. 10%, we would end up with a $10,000 total increase. With a 12.5%, we would end up with an $8,000 total increase. 15% would be $6,670 total increase, and a 25% minimum reserve requirement would be $4,000. So, using our equations, our money multiplier, and our amount deposited, we can find our expansion of the money supply, our total increase, and we can also, going back, we can find, using our reserve requirement, find what amount is reserved to be required, and our money multiplier.